The second half of the royal variety performance opened with a burst of energy that seemed to catch even the most composed members of the audience off guard. The curtain rose to reveal an enormous set, all sweeping staircases and cascading lights, and the dancers who filled it moved with a precision and exuberance that drew an immediate round of applause before a single note had been played. This was the kind of opening that reminded you what live performance could do. The way it could reach across the dark of an auditorium and grab you by the chest and pull you forward in your seat, whether you meant to move or not. In the royal box, Prince William sat slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his attention entirely on the stage below. Catherine sat beside him, her green gown pooling softly around her, her expression one of delighted concentration. Those who could see them from nearby boxes or through the lenses of carefully positioned cameras noticed how naturally comfortable they seemed, not bored, not performing their own enjoyment for the cameras, but genuinely absorbed. It was the posture of two people who had given the evening their full permission to delight them, and it did. The second half brought with it a different emotional range than the first. Where the opening acts had leaned into spectacle and comedy, the middle of the show settled into something more intimate, more personal. A singer took the stage who had not performed publicly in nearly 2 years, having stepped away following a period of serious illness. Her return to the royal variety stage had been kept largely secret, known only to those closest to the production, and when her name was announced, and she walked out into the light, the response from the audience was immediate and overwhelming. People rose to their feet. The applause built and rolled and continued even as she reached the microphone and stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes full. She sang a song she had written during her recovery, a song about finding your way back to yourself, about the long, quiet work of healing, about the surprising places where hope turns up when you least expect it. Her voice was not quite what it had been at its peak, a little more fragile at the edges, a little more careful with the high notes, but it had something in it now that had not been there before, a texture that came from real experience, from having actually lived through what the song described. The audience was very still. Even the photographers at the side of the stage lowered their cameras without thinking about it. Catherine was visibly moved. Those sitting close enough could see her press her lips together, the way people do when they are determined not to cry in public. William noticed, the way a person notices these things about someone they know and love deeply, and he reached over and briefly took her hand. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it was one of those moments that seemed to freeze slightly in time, to ask to be remembered. Afterward, when asked about the performance, Catherine would describe it as the highlight of the evening, not because of the technical skill of the singer, though that was considerable, but because of what the song was about and the courage it took to stand up and sing it in front of thousands of people. The mood lifted again after the interval of quiet emotion that the singer had created. And a well-known comedian from television beloved for his sharp wit and his ability to find the absurdity in everyday British life bounded onto the stage and within 30 seconds had the entire hall in stitches. He had a gift for timing that made the jokes feel inevitable even when they were completely surprising, and he worked the audience with the casual confidence of someone who has spent 20 years doing exactly this and still loves every minute of it. William laughed loudly at one particular joke, a self-deprecating bit about the experience of being recognized everywhere you go. And Catherine covered her mouth with one hand as she laughed, her shoulders shaking. The comedian, who could see the royal box from the stage, caught the prince's reaction and, without missing a beat, delivered a follow-up line that made it clear he had noticed too, earning a second wave of laughter from the audience and a grinning acknowledgement from William that the crowd found enormously charming. These unscripted moments, the comedian and the prince sharing a beat of genuine amusement across the vast space of the auditorium, were exactly the kind of thing that made the royal variety performance something more than a concert or a television show. They were the moments that made it an event, a genuine gathering of people around something alive and unpredictable. Behind the scenes, the production team was managing the usual controlled chaos of a live show of this scale. Cue cards were being updated in real time. A microphone pack on one of the dancers had gone slightly wrong and was being replaced during the comedian's set by a backstage technician who moved with the focused efficiency of someone who had solved this exact problem many times before. The stage manager stood at her monitor with the headset on, speaking in the quiet, measured tones of someone who has learned that calm is contagious. That if you stay steady, the people around you tend to steady themselves. The young comedian from Birmingham, the one who had dreamed of this stage since he was 12, who had carried his grandmother's memory into the dressing room with him, was waiting in the wings for his slot in the latter portion of the second half. The nerves had passed through him in waves over the course of the evening, arriving with sudden intensity and then subsiding, only to return again a few minutes later. But now, as he stood in the half-dark of the wings and listened to the comedian currently on stage work the crowd, something shifted. The nerves did not go away exactly, but they changed in character. They became less like fear and more like fuel. He had 10 minutes of material that he had performed dozens of times in smaller venues. He knew it well enough that it lived in his body rather than just his memory. He knew where the laughs should come and how long they would last if everything was working. And he knew what to do if a joke landed differently than he expected. He was ready. He thought about his grandmother one more time, saw her in his mind's eye in that front room with the old television, and he smiled. Then his name was called, and he walked out into the light. The audience gave him a warm reception. They knew him from television, had laughed at him before through their screens, and were already predisposed toward him. But there is a difference between the connection you make through a screen and the one you make in person in a room in real time, with no retakes and no editing. In person, everything is amplified and immediate, and within the first 90 seconds, it became clear that this young man was not going to be intimidated by the room or the occasion. He was going to own it. He talked about growing up in Birmingham, about his family, about the particular experience of being someone whose life had changed very quickly and unexpectedly, and who was still, in many quiet ways, trying to catch up with his own good fortune. There was something in the way he told these stories that felt completely honest. Not the performed honesty of someone who has learned that vulnerability is a technique, but the real thing, the slightly awkward, unpolished truth of a person who does not yet know how to be anything other than exactly what he is. The audience adored him for it. In the royal box, Catherine leaned over to say something to William during a brief pause between bits, and William nodded emphatically. The way you do when someone has just put into words something you were already feeling, but had not quite articulated. The comedian was exceptionally good. That much was clear to everyone in the hall. But there was also something else, a quality harder to define, something that had to do with authenticity and hunger and the particular light that comes off a person who is living there, dream in real time and knows it. The violinist from Edinburgh took the stage after the comedian, and the contrast was deliberate and beautifully managed by the show's producers. After the warmth and noise of the comedy, the audience settled quickly into the hush that classical music demands. And the violinist, a small woman with a composed face and quick, sure hands, began to play something that the program notes described simply as a new composition, though those who knew her work recognized it immediately as something she had been working toward for years. The piece moved through several distinct emotional territories in the space of about 8 minutes, beginning in something that felt like grief or loss and moving, not quickly or easily, but honestly, through restlessness and searching before arriving, in the final 2 minutes, at something that could only be called peace. It was the kind of music that does not explain itself, that trusts its audience to bring their own experiences to it and find whatever meaning they need. Different people in the hall that night would later describe what it made them think of: a father who had lost a son, a woman who had recently come through a divorce, a young man who had just started a new job in a new city and was still finding his footing. The music was the same for all of them. What they found in it was their own. When the final curtain came down on the Royal Variety performance, the applause that filled the Royal Albert Hall was not the polite, reflexive kind that audiences sometimes produce out of habit at the end of a long evening. It was the real thing, deep and sustained and rising, the sound of hundreds of people expressing something they could not quite put into words, but needed to express nonetheless. The performers lined the stage and took their bows, some laughing with pure joy, some visibly emotional. One elderly comedian in the back row, dabbing at his eyes with his pocket square in a way that he would later claim was entirely due to the stage lights in the royal box. William and Catherine were on their feet with the rest of the audience, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Catherine caught the eye of the young violinist during the bows and gave her a nod of real admiration. One of those small, direct acknowledgments that a person remembers for the rest of their life. The violinist later told a journalist that in all her years of performing, she had never felt so seen in a single gesture. What came next was, in many ways, the part of the royal variety performance that the general public never saw, or saw only in glimpses through the formal photographs that would be released the following morning. After the house lights came up and the audience began to file out through the great arched exits of the Royal Albert Hall, William and Catherine were escorted backstage for the traditional meeting with the performers, a ritual that had been part of the event for generations, and one that both of them took seriously. The backstage area of the Royal Albert Hall is a world unto itself. On a night like this, a maze of corridors and dressing rooms and storage spaces that hums with a particular kind of post-performance energy. The makeup is still on. The costumes have not yet been returned to their racks. People are coming down from the high of a successful show, talking too fast and laughing too easily, the adrenaline still working its way out of their systems. Into this warm and slightly chaotic atmosphere, William and Catherine arrived with their small team of aides, and the effect was immediate. The performers who had been gathered to meet the royal couple stood in a carefully arranged line, but the formality dissolved quickly. William moved along the line with the ease of someone who is genuinely curious about the people he is meeting, asking questions that showed he had paid close attention to the performances, not the general questions that people ask when they are going through the motions, but specific ones, the kind that let a performer know that you were actually watching, that you actually heard them. He stopped for a long time with the young comedian from Birmingham, the one who had dreamed of this moment since childhood. They talked for several minutes, and those standing nearby could hear William asking about his background, about how he had gotten started, about whether this was what he had imagined it would be. The comedian, who had thought he was prepared for this meeting, who had rehearsed a few light remarks in the mirror that morning, found himself speaking freely and honestly, the way you do when someone is actually listening. And William listened with the kind of focused attention that makes people feel, however briefly, like they are the most interesting person in the room. Catherine, meanwhile, had stopped with the singer, who had returned to the stage after her illness. The two women spoke quietly, away from the main group, and whatever passed between them was not captured by any camera. What was noted by those nearby was the expression on the singer's face when the conversation ended, a look of genuine relief, the kind that comes when something you have been carrying for a long time has been acknowledged by another person, and, in being acknowledged, has become slightly lighter. Catherine had a particular talent for these moments. She had cultivated, over the years of her public life, the ability to be fully present with a person in a crowd, to make them feel, in the middle of an official engagement, with all its formality and choreography, that they were genuinely seen and genuinely valued. It was not a trick or a technique. It came from a real quality of attention that she brought to every encounter, a real belief that the person in front of her mattered, that their experience was worth knowing about. The performers backstage that night would remember her, not just as a beautiful woman in a green gown, but as someone who had listened to them. The photographer from the official royal team moved discreetly through the backstage meeting, capturing images that would be shared on the official royal social media channels and released to the press the following morning. These photographs, taken with the skilled eye for the small moments that tell the real story, would show William mid-laugh with the comedian, Catherine, with her hand briefly touching the arm of the singer, both of them looking relaxed and warm in a way that felt true to the evening's spirit. Outside the hall, the crowd had not entirely dispersed. The November air was sharp now, well past 10 in the evening, and the dedicated few who remained were bundled in coats and scarves, their breath making small clouds in the cold. When word filtered through that the royal couple would be departing soon, there was a renewed surge of energy, people pressing forward against the barriers, phones raised, voices calling out. A small girl near the front of the barrier had fallen asleep, standing up against her father's leg, her face pressed into his coat, completely unmoved by the excitement around her. He was holding her upright with one arm, his other hand raised with the phone. And when William and Catherine emerged from the building, and he looked up and caught his daughter's expression of total, dreaming peace, he laughed quietly to himself. William noticed the little girl immediately. He walked toward that section of the barrier, and crouched slightly to be at her level, and when she did not wake, he and her father exchanged a look of shared amusement. The look of two people who both knew the particular comedy of a child who refuses to be impressed by anything because they have already gone somewhere much more interesting. Catherine came and stood beside William, and the three of them, the prince, the princess, and the sleeping child, were captured by a dozen cameras, and the image was one of those that would travel fast and far, the great public occasion and the small private moment coexisting in the same frame, neither diminishing the other. The car that would take William and Catherine back through London was waiting at the side of the venue. The drive would take them through streets that were still busy even at this hour. London does not sleep easily, and past illuminated landmarks that they had seen so many times that they had become like old friends. The curve of the Thames, the lit faces of the bridges, the dark shapes of the trees in Hyde Park against the orange glow of the streetlights. In the back of the car, away from the cameras and the crowds and the careful choreography of public life, they would simply be two people on the way home, talking about the evening, about what had stayed with them, about what they wanted to remember. Back inside the Royal Albert Hall, the cleanup crews were already moving through the auditorium, collecting programs left on seats and straightening rows and restoring the space to its ordinary self. The stage was being struck, the elaborate set for the opening number of the second half being dismantled with practiced speed. The dressing rooms were emptying as performers changed back into their ordinary clothes and made their way to the green room for the post-show gathering, where food and drinks had been laid out, and the release of the evening's tension was already producing the euphoric, oversharing kind of conversation that follows a successful show. The young comedian from Birmingham sat at a corner table with a plate of food he was not really eating, his phone in his hand, composing a message to his mother that he could not quite get right. He had already called her during the interval to tell her how it was going, and she had cried a little on the phone, which had made him cry a little too, which he had told no one about. Now, he was trying to find the words to describe the rest of the evening. The performance, the meeting with William and Catherine, the handshake with the prince, and the 2 minutes of conversation that had felt, inexplicably, like being known by someone who had no particular reason to know you. He wrote and deleted 3 versions of the message before giving up and simply typing. It was everything. Mum, I wish she could have been here. He put down the phone and ate a bite of food, and looked around the room at the other performers. The dancers drinking water and stretching their calves. The singer, surrounded by a protective circle of friends. The violinist, already deep in conversation with the show's musical director, and he felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The Royal Variety Charity, on whose behalf all of this had been organized and performed and attended, would later announce that the evening had raised a record amount for their work supporting people in the entertainment industry who had fallen on difficult times. The figure, when it was released, produced a round of genuine celebration among the charity's trustees and staff, who knew better than anyone what that money would mean in practical terms. The heating bills paid, the rent covered, the medical expenses met, the small dignities restored to people who had spent their lives making others laugh and cry and dream. The night air over London carried a quiet electricity, the kind that settles over a city when something truly special is about to happen. It was a cool November evening, and the streets around the Royal Albert Hall were already buzzing with excitement. Black cars moved slowly through the crowd-lined roads. Police officers stood at their posts with practiced calm. and photographers jostled for position behind the metal barriers. Their cameras ready, their fingers eager. Thousands of ordinary people had gathered hours before, not because they had been asked to, but because they simply could not stay away. They had come to catch a glimpse of something they felt belonged to them in some small but meaningful way. Their prince and princess, stepping out together into the golden light of one of Britain's most beloved annual events, Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, were attending the Royal Variety performance. And from the very first moment their car was spotted rounding the corner near the venue, the crowd erupted. Children waved small flags. Older women clutched each other's arms and pointed. Men who had come along quietly, dragged by enthusiastic partners, found themselves craning their necks just as much as everyone else. There was something about the sight of William and Kate together, something warm and familiar, yet always, somehow fresh, that never quite lost its power to move people. Catherine stepped out of the car first, and the gasp from the crowd was immediate. She wore a stunning forest green gown that swept the ground as she moved, its deep color rich and regal against the bright lights of the venue entrance. Her hair was styled in soft, loose waves that fell past her shoulders, and the jewelry she wore was elegant but understated. A pair of diamond drop earrings that caught the light with every slight movement of her head. She smiled as she stepped onto the red carpet, not the polished, practiced smile of someone performing a duty, but a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, that tells you the person wearing it is genuinely happy to be exactly where they are. William stepped out right behind her, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit, his posture straight and confident, his own smile wide and easy. He placed his hand briefly